Hello. This is Irene with SaugaTalks. Hello, everyone. If you're watching us today and you're watching us today, a very simple request. Please like this post if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, Twitter, or listening on major podcasting platforms. Fabulous experts, influencers, leaders, business, technical, you name it. And they're so generous with their time. They're so generous to share what they finding in the intricate world of technology out there that please, if you're with us, if you like what we're doing, it's so simple. Press the like, share with your network, share with your groups. And again, I'm Irene. Today, here with me at SaugaTalks, Slater Victoroff. How are you, Slater?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Irene. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I'm so excited. Thank you for being part of the show. Very high level conversation for all of us. Is it consumer experience? Is it employees? Is it investors? What's out there for all of us? Or it gets very, very technical. So, and there is this huge division between two camps. All right. And some looking at the other side of that fence, and not exactly liking each other very much. AI, what excites you now about trends we hear about work you do? Let's open up with that.
Yeah, so I think AI is a really fascinating space, and you kind of hit the nail on the head in that it's in this really interesting sort of liminal space where it impacts everyone. I mean, there's no one in the world today. If you use any piece of technology, or even if you don't, right, you're being impacted by AI in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, when you look at the very bleeding edge of what's happening, right, it's incredibly difficult to really grok what's going on, to really understand what it is that's happening. And we don't really have kind of a society or a culture that is meant to have things go from the bleeding edge of research to wide consumer adoption as quickly as this has been happening, right? And I think that's something that puts AI in a really sort of unique situation. But I also think that as you kind of double click on each of those zones, right, it's like this fractal division of people that just hate each other. And I think that's one of the things that people, have to understand about AI the second they walk into it. Is like anything you say, you're going to offend somebody in the space, right? There's so many holy wars, there's so many different camps and different groups. But I think one of the things that's really amazing, certainly compared to a decade ago when I first got into this space, is there was a lot of really really good work coming out. So that's maybe the place to benchmark, right? What do I bring to this? Like, what's my point of view? Is I think that there's a lot of really incredible work going on. I don't believe that we've got some panacea, magical Terminator AI, right? I think that's very very far off, right? But I think that there has been really incredible progress in the space of language, right? In the space of vision and sort of these perception problems, really broadly. But what's I think most interesting about it is that as we succeed at these problems that we once saw as being extremely difficult, how it kind of brings the intricacies and kind of wonder of human intelligence into this really crisp focus, where we can show both these incredible things that we can now do with AI that we couldn't do before. But then you have, I think a really good conversation that says, okay, well, we can do this, but what can we still not do? And why is it that despite the fact that we can classify 1,000 images into 1,000 classes and figure out a Welsh short hair corgi from like a I don't know, British long hair corgi, right? Why is it that despite we can do all of these really interesting fine grained things, we can't walk on two legs, right? That we can't do these very very basic things on kind of the converse of that, and it's really led to a really interesting explosion questions around AI, around what are the hard problems, what are the interesting problems, and there's two different lenses. You can take a consumer lens, but frankly, I have very little talent with the consumer. Like I'm like anti-materialist. Like I don't want things. Like people like Alexa. I don't like Alexa. I still use paper and pen to write everything down. So I just I tend to be a little bit more enterprise oriented, but I think that when you start to realize how much work people are doing that I think people are not well suited to, that's really where you start to see the potential for AI in very, very broad strokes.
I love few points you made right there. You know what? Going from the big shiny toy, let's pound a little further on AGI. Okay, because some skeptics are so terrified. They say
Yeah.
we as human we're not strong enough to resist. Okay. On the other camp, I hear, you know what, we're not even get there in next decade.
You know,
So all the
and
panic, yeah.
that's the struggle, right? Is like nobody has the same definition of AGI, right? And you will see research out there everywhere from AGI is imminent and will have impacts, you know, in the next 5 years of the scale of all-out nuclear war, right? And like that, those are like literal quotes that I have found in papers, right? And you have it from there to, you know, I think Gary Marcus is obviously very outspoken, and I think he, you know, his point of view is a lot more realistic than the first one. That, you know, we're just completely far off, right? Like we're nowhere near this sort of you know, ethereal target of AGI, right? And we've got a very far way to go. And you know, he's got some opinions on how to get there. Um, my view is first and foremost, AGI is really ill-defined. I think the question of, you know, what human intelligence is, what it is that makes us really special, what is going on in the brain, I think is still a mystery to us as much as anyone. Right. I actually just found out in a very curious thing. You know, I suffer from a weird kind of neurological issue called misophonia, and apparently there was some research that came out that said it might be an overactivation in the mirror neurons. Right. So it's just like I see people making like some weird expression with their face and making a sound, you know, slurping or something like that. My brain starts doing exactly the same thing, and my emotions start going haywire. Right. I had no idea, right? That's happening in my own brain, right? It's this subtle thing. It's like a very common kind of situation, but it's this like weird mental, you know, kind of situation. I'm sort of like, if the human mind is still such a mystery to us, right? What hope do we have to replicate that faithfully? So I'm like, I don't know, right? Like I can't do it. Maybe at some point in the future that will be possible. So I think a lot more about where are we now and what is a good, sensible next step. And so I guess in that way, I'm kind of myopic, right? You know, but my next step is still probably a decade out. So, you know, I think outside of a decade, it's very hard to think about what's happening, and I don't see AGI within a decade.
I have an interest. How do we adapt? You know, how do we make enterprise work better? How do we make people lives better in
Right.
workplace?
I think that's exactly right, and I think there's one example that I kind of pointed out just on the like to wrap up the AGI side of things, right? Because people know about the Turing test, right? Of, you know, if I'm in a text conversation with some bot and it manages to convince me that it's a human, then we've achieved AGI. And I think there's a really simple example to point out actually why that's such a flawed test. Because you can imagine a very simple question: how tall are you? What color is your hair? Right? And then you immediately start to ask the follow up question: what is the right answer to that? Right? Is it supposed to have a particular body or not? Right? And you can think of, you know, 1,000 very simple questions along those lines that I think just very quickly point out, oh, this idea of what exactly it is that makes human intelligence is really nebulous, very, very hard to pin down. And, you know, we've been debating this for thousands of years. AI, think, casts it in interesting light, but it's, you know, a sliver of additional information in thousands of years of, you know, inconclusive philosophical thought. So I don't think we're going
Exactly.
to solve it with
And
computers.
and just throw some, you know, some fire on it, Slater. As the people, just in this simple conversational example you're giving, as people, we're almost calculating what's expected of us.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
the answers we give is not necessarily we just mechanically repeat what we know on the topic, right? We're
Right.
trying to please, or we're trying to, I don't know, conflict or some other agenda that we have. Do you know if AI can do that now?
Well, see, that's one of the things that's, I think, so interesting, right? And it's something that, you know, people circle back to again and again. It's this question of agency, right? Of ownership, of like, are you conscious of your space in the world? Or actually, sorry, let me maybe put that off to one
Mhm.
side, because I think that's actually a little separate, right? But it's like, do you have your own desires? And I wrote this piece a little while ago about the existential crisis of AI, and I actually think this is sort of a fork. I think there's two camps here, and you don't see a lot of language about this. I think that it's only been very recently that AI has advanced far enough that there's a meaningful distinction. But I think there's two very different camps here, right? There's sort of the Bionists, I'll say, right, and then there's the, you know, like Androidists. And very, very roughly, the idea is like, are you thinking about this as assistive technology, right? Or are you thinking about this as technology that is meant to replace people, right? That being an android and assistive technology being this bionic arm. And I think it really influences the way that you think about this AI technology very, very broadly. And that's the reason that I point at this question, how tall are you in the Turing test? Because in the Android camp, there is a right answer to that, right? And you should kind of assume, be an individual and attempt to replicate that, right? In the kind of bionicist, right, like bionic arm camp, right, where you're thinking about this as primarily an assistive technology, well, the Turing test doesn't even make sense, right? Why would you do that in the first place, right? The question is much more, okay, I want to benchmark some human machine system. And from my perspective, that's just a mental model that is much, much more productive. I think we're far enough from being able to replicate a human in its entirety in kind of that Android view that I just think the bionicist, kind of that bionic arm view, is much, much more productive, at least for the next decade.
So let's jump into some practical adoption of
Hmm.
fabulous technology that been proven. So
Yes.
skeptics seeing AI winter, all right? Skeptics seeing, the loss of interest, investors are more selective. You know how that goes. Not every shiny experiment now gets funded, right?
I mean, there was a lot of low quality stuff out there, I will say. I do not fault the investors for that.
Tell us more. Tell us more. What kind of high quality experiments that worth development, developing it, throwing money at it, throwing people and people years in life of
Yeah,
work versus some of the
absolutely.
shallow. Yep. Mhm.
No, I mean, I think it happens with everything, right? The hype cycle, for all of its simplicities, there is an accuracy in it, right? And when all of these amazing, I think a lot of the first wave were these vision applications, right? Like really rich understanding on your YouTube videos. Some people might remember, a decade or so ago, right? Suddenly, all of that technology and like image search and whatnot got just like way better almost overnight, right? So that was kind of the first, signal, and then that popped off, a lot of other advances across language and whatnot. But as with all things, right, when you've got an initial advance, you've got a lot of people that will kind of flock to it and throw a lot of other mess around there. And there was a lot of hype, right? I think if you look at the space that Indico is, I don't want to talk a huge amount about it as like pitch or anything, but in the unstructured space, if you look at the success rate, only about 50% of projects are getting into production at all, if you're looking at these AI projects. And then less than half of those are staying in production for a full year, right? And so in aggregate, right, these success rates are really, really bad. And I think that there is a very reasonable kind of pullback. On the flip side, and I think what makes us very different than a lot of earlier generations of AI winters, and why I wouldn't really say we're headed for that, is that there's tons of evidence, right? It's not like people invested a huge amount just speculatively and didn't get any return and no one has seen anything, right? It's like, no, like you see Google, you see Facebook, you see Microsoft, you see Tesla, right? Like people are doing this successfully, they're doing it at scale, and they are making money hand over fist doing it, right? And they're doing it in a lot of different domains. Even if you kind of expand out to the more, traditional AI kind of data providers like Databricks and Snowflake, right? They're very much a part of the space, right? Sort of selling picks and shovels, to use that metaphor. So there is success, there is gold out there. I think that is the distinction. I think that, certainly the macroeconomic conditions are really rough now for pretty much anyone in a growth stage. There's a lot of AI companies there. I think in the IDP space, there's already been some winnowing out, some shaking out. I think that's probably going to continue. But I think it's natural. I think ultimately it probably ends up being healthy. It's kind of the natural cycle of things. I don't see it as a winter impending. I see it as an overdue correction, and I just hope that things don't get chaotic. I guess that becomes a little bit of the problem, right? Because I think both valuations were ridiculously inflated, and then it was not. I mean, the war in Ukraine is like horrible and bad. Don't get me wrong, but it was not even just that macro shock, right? It was that plus like 3 or 4 other like massive global level macro shocks that were strangely interrelated at the same time. And while things seem like okay, and this seems, from one perspective, like a really, healthy, normal market correction, it's weird, right? I don't think there has ever been a situation like this, certainly not in my lifetime, You also see, again, just to name a couple of these things, these interest rates going up, right, and inflation in the state that it is, and it's just like, this has never happened before, and I don't think people really know what things are going to look like in 12 months, and so I feel 80% sure, this is going to be a pretty normal market correction. But that 20% is real. And I don't know what it looks like in the alternative, right? But it's probably going to be strange in another market that looks unlike anything we've seen.
Helping hand. How do you find the professionals? This time we're talking about doctors, we're talking about medical technicians. How you think we are embracing this helping hand, this robotic kind of enhancing, augmenting help from AI?
So I love the way that you framed that, because I think that's exactly, and medical imaging I think is a perfect area, right? Because I think for years people were just like, this is the obvious application, medical imaging is it, right? And there were so many startups that just surged at that use case and fail, right? And it was really weird. It's like, what happened, right? This should be a no-brainer, right? Even Geoffrey Hinton in, I want to say 2012, 2013 or something like that, he said, don't train to be a radiologist. Like, you're all going to be automated in the next 5 years. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened. And I think, there's a really key lesson in that, and it's encapsulated in those words you used, helping hand, right? And I think that was really the oversight, right? I think that if there is a big misstep in the first generation of AI, that is really it, is a lack of emphasis on what it is to be a helping hand. Because if you do approach it, from day one with that idea of not, I'm going to try to replace the radiologist, because probably, I might not know this as an AI researcher, right? But probably they're doing more than just looking at a picture. Right. If I had to guess, we don't pay people, as much money as we do just for that.
With all the years it went in training, with all the years of practicing, and
they are probably doing something, right?
Hopefully,
and it turns out, and I guess it took AI folks a long time to learn that. But I think you start to think more about how this can be a helping hand, and you have to really ask them. And I think that's what it comes down to, is that AI researchers are very, very good at, building AI models, right? They are very, very bad at understanding use cases and figuring out the best way to connect that to an end user. And I think that's why you see a lot of, what you talked about earlier is this big divide, right? Is that, frankly, if you're a good ML researcher nowadays, it's a pretty good deal, right? And if you're a researcher, you're probably a researcher because you don't want to have to deal with how this thing is going to get out into the real world. That's messy. That's really, really gross, right? Math is nice and it's very clean and it's straightforward, right? And, the real world applications can be someone else's problem. And, as the expertise kind of becomes more mainstream and as it becomes more, distributed and accessible, right? I think you start to see that come back a bit, right? But I think today, because there's no need for it to work any other way, I guess, from their perspective. They're like, I'm making plenty of money. I'm making stuff that's really valuable to, this very small handful of companies, right? And progress is being made. But I guess I think that's really what helps to shift that ultimately, right? Because, I think it's asking too much for a researcher to become a user experience expert, right? Or become a legal expert. That's just never going to happen. Right. It has to be about kind of that middle area, that connective tissue that's figuring out, okay, how do we take the stuff that academics are developing over here that's really, really good work, right? And figure out how to build that middle layer that actually makes it understandable, and accessible, I think, to, I'll say, less and non-technical folks as two separate groups, right? With two separate needs, right? And some of that is as simple as Alexa presumably is a cool thing for the people that have it and use it, right? So that's a cool consumer application, I guess. Right. But I think then there's much more practical stuff, right? If you start to think about a mortgage application, right? That's a horrific, painful experience for everyone involved, right? Or if you think about tax season, right? And all the forms that you have to file, horrific, painful experience for everyone involved, right? Why can't that all be done in, 10 minutes, in a primarily AI-oriented way that just has a person kind of double checking a few of the most important fields, right?
You just stepped into my favorite space, intelligent automation, right?
Yes. I mean, I think that's obviously I'm extremely excited about that. I wouldn't have started a business in that space if I didn't love it. But what are you most interested about in intelligent automation? I think that might be an interesting question.
Breadth and depth. Okay, it's going from very simple scenario you just described, just to speed up mortgage application, just to help people who are day to day have to check number of forms, number of screens, and just living their lives in this, like, buried in the unhuman environment. How about that, right? So
Yeah.
empathy to those people, all right, that makes me, being excited about it. Very simple task, and yet so many companies still behind on this. Not even a question, right? Huge field, huge
Yeah.
application, and small improvement drives people into better places, drive company into better financial situations, don't you think?
Yeah, and I mean it makes processes more consistent. And I think that, there's I think a lot of different parts of this spectrum. I think that on maybe that far kind of very impactful side, when you start talking about loan approvals and mortgage applications, not only does the efficiency of that, result in, a meaningfully better experience in life for, the consumer going through it, right? But also it means that things are suddenly much more consistent, where, even if two people have been doing the same process for 30 years, having, now gone through and kind of worked to automate a lot of these, it does not mean they are doing it the same way. Right. Because usually the amount of transparency you've got into these unstructured processes, I'd say, and documents are just a great example. It's, the document landed on Susie's desk. Susie says the document is good, right? Like application approved, right? Or Susie says the document is bad, application rejected, right? And it's this very, very simple coarse level of information. And I think that's one really incredible insight, is like, by making things consistent enough that you can start to automate them and start to plug AI into these different pieces, right? You also just end up making the process better. You have suddenly this confidence that you sort of have in the past because you trust people doing it, but you don't really have, because you know that the people are kind of stretched to their limit and they have to process a huge amount of data. And we always like to think of, what can the well-rested person that, just had their cup of coffee, and like rested for an hour can do, right? But in practice, right, that's not who you're getting, right? You're getting the person, at 4 p.m., just trying to get their last couple done so they can hit their quota for the end of the day before they head out and like try to get out before rush hour, right? And I think that's a really, really important distinction. And you start to ask this idea of, why is it, that we're still reading documents the same way that we did in the past, right? Why is that experience fundamentally unchanged? And you start to realize, there actually can be a lot of really, really interesting ways to try to systematize the way that we read through these documents. But, even though, documents have been around fundamentally unchanged for, thousands of years, except now we scan them into a PDF document. I think there has been a really meaningful change in that, in the state of AI, just in the last couple of years, right? Where we can get after that stuff very, very effectively. And, I think a human still can and should be involved in that process. But, they can be 10 times more efficient today.
And we can safely and happily delegate. Because again, somewhere else I read that human brain, as capable as we are, we're not created to go through 1,000 emails and go
Right.
through 1,000 documents.
We're
That's
not.
not our strength.
We're inconsistent, right? And I think that's more than anything, the thing that I want to scream from the rooftops, right? We are not the same. And that's why I consider myself very much, on the bionic side, right? I'm like, bionic arms are just like so powerful, because I don't know if we can build a brain in silicon with digital logic. I legitimately don't know. Some people believe yes, definitely. Some people believe no, absolutely not. I'm like, look, I don't know, but I'm less interested in that question, actually, because I think it's so much more efficient and effective to say, well, how can I use this digital interface? How can I use silicon? How can I use the AI tools that actually exist today, rather than the ones that I'm hoping might exist, tomorrow, to interface with a human in the optimal way, such that like the human is doing what they're best at, the machine is doing what they're best at, right? And everyone wins, right? Like that's a multiplicative effect, right? You don't spend $1 billion in simulation to get one human, right? Like we've got billions of humans, right? Like humans are great, like the human mind is an incredible thing. But you start to think maybe it's not worth $1 billion to create one more person in silicon, right? Maybe we should think about it a different way and try to come up with these, uniform kind of bionic arms that are in human control and think really intentionally about the way that the human controls these tools.
We are. And we are in the best place in history of humankind to help us to be more human, okay? To start,
Yes.
we're not using, the manual calculators anymore. We're not counting with our fingers. How about we don't have to read as many documents that are repetitive, that
Hmm.
can be automated. So I'm with you, absolutely.
Well, I
Slater,
think there's a. Oh, I was just gonna say, I think there's a really interesting example here, right, in sort of speech interfaces, right? Because I think that was the thing. Like, if you wind back the clock, right, to like what was the thing that just like everyone thought was going to be in the future, and just like everyone would love. It's these speech interfaces, right? It's like the Jarvis and Iron Man and stuff like that. And we've got speech technology now, right? Like you look at Alexa, like these things exist explicitly. They're very very high quality. Like they work. We have that. However, we learned that speech is good for some things, but actually is really bad for a lot of things. So it's really cool, I think, and that kind of shows the opportunity, right? Because now that what was so impossible even just a few years ago is within our grasp, we suddenly realize, oh, this wasn't like quite as nice as it looked from far away, right? But then you get to ask the really cool question, which is, okay, well, what's next? What's a better way of interacting, right? And I think the kind of world is wide open there. I think there's just so much potential in that.
absolutely, absolutely, Slater. I so appreciate you sharing the insights and human perspective, okay? Because let's not forget, as being technologists, it's important to wear this very human and empathical hat most of the time, right? We know what happens when we are getting too mechanistic, I would say.
I mean,
So
we're building things for humans at the end of the day.
absolutely. And for humans, for those doctors to accept that help, and for loan adjudicators to accept that help, we have to empathize with them. We
and,
have to
and
know
not
that, yeah.
presume that we know what's best.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. That never works. We are,
No, it
yeah,
doesn't.
we're not gonna have an argument here on that later. Absolutely. In conclusion, can we leave our audience with maybe three takeaways? I want to ask you about next decade AI. Pick your favorite trends. Pick something that you think is going to grow and help us be better than we are today.
I think embodied AI talking about the next decade is immediately number one, right? It's one of those things that just at that boundary of possible. And I think if you start looking at the things that we can do in the robotic space a handful of years from now, you're going to be astonished, right? I mean, there have been great advances looking at Boston dynamics and stuff like that, right? But I think that's going to look very simple in a handful of years, and I'm very excited for it. I think additionally, machine teaching really, really compelling, kind of sub area of the ML field, but very focused on this idea of how do I make great interfaces for people and think about how I construct that panel between the human and the machine. So machine teaching, I think, is just going to be absolutely, absolutely huge, right? And I think the final thing that I'll say is, very broadly, multimodal AI, which is the idea of combining experiences from different modalities like text and image or infrared cameras, right, and RGB sensors and LiDAR, right? I think when you look at the next generation of AI, it's no question that it's going to be multimodal.